Hi, welcome to Disrupting Systems of Oppression using critical pedagogy tools in music education. My name is Rebecca Rivers. I am a independent music educator and researcher based out of Seattle, Washington in the US. Today, I want to talk about a question. Can the way we teach create a more equitable experience for students from all backgrounds? Now, I'm not just talking about the content we teach, but the actual way we approach it. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to introduce two models. We're going to talk about the 4 systems of oppression, and then we're going to talk about problem posing, which is a critical pedagogy technique or model. Then we're going to see how we might apply problem posing to interrupt the 4 systems of oppression in 2 case studies. We're just going to do a little test and see if we can apply those to something that happened in real life. So let's jump in. First, John Bell in 2013 gave us an idea for how to kind of think about how oppression happens. He suggested it as 4 systems of oppression that he calls the 4 I's. First, ideological oppression. Now, ideological oppression is when one group of people believes that they are better than another group of people, and for some reason believes that they have the right to oppress the group that they believe they're superior to. Now, the second system of oppression is institutional. So institutional oppression happens when you have this ideological oppression, but then it is incorporated into the systems of society, like our laws, our police practices, our education systems. Remember that one, we're going to talk about it again, and even our media imagery, okay? Our third system is interpersonal. Now, interpersonal oppression happens when you have this ideology, this ideological oppression, that is then reinforced by the institutions around us, and that emboldens individuals to disrespect or oppress another person who's from a non-dominant group. Specifically, an individual from the dominant group or the oppressor group then enacts it on somebody who is not from the dominant group. Now, finally, we have internalized oppression. Now, internalized oppression happens when we have this ideology behind an oppressive idea that is then reflected in our institutions around us and is then perpetrated by individuals. And then the person who's being oppressed maybe starts to internalize some of these negative ideologies about themselves. Now, what do we do when these systems of oppression are at play in our music education settings? Now, one tool that we can use for this, just one of many, but one we can use is critical pedagogy, specifically problem-posing education. Now, in the 1960s, Paulo Freire, a Brazilian pedagogue, wrote his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And in this book, he proposes 2 models, the banking model, which is we're going to talk about what these are, but this represents traditional education. And then he proposed problem posing as an alternative to the banking model. Now let's look at what these are. First, the banking model. In both of these, problem posing and banking, we have 3 characters at play. We have the teacher, we have the student, and then we have the established knowledge. Now, established knowledge is all of the knowledge that society thinks is important to pass on through education. So often it's assembled by kind of experts in the field. It's usually what's in our curricula. So this is what we are going to study. Now, in the banking model, the teacher takes the established knowledge and deposits it in the student's brain. The idea is that the student is this passive vessel of learning. They're just waiting to soak it all up. They don't know anything, hence banking, because it's like a deposit into the student's brain. Now, in this interaction, we have to assume a few things. Number 1, We have to assume that the student doesn't know anything. They don't have any world experience. They don't have any knowledge about the subject matter. They are just a passive learner. We also have to assume that the teacher has some level of unquestionable expertise because they are depositing all of this knowledge in us and we're not asking questions. So we have to have a lot of trust that the teacher really knows what they're doing. We also have to have a lot of trust in the established knowledge itself. We can't question it. We have to just accept it. Now, the alternative to this that Freire proposed is problem-posing education. You still have your three characters, the teacher, the student, the established knowledge, but instead of this deposit transaction, the teacher steps alongside the student, and together they become investigative partners who ask questions or pose problems about the established knowledge. The idea is that you begin to investigate the content that you are studying, and you investigate it in two ways. First, you define the problem. The idea here, when we say problem, is that you're asking questions. So you define the problem. What are the power dynamics that are inherent in this established knowledge? Who is it representing? Who is it not representing? And also, what assumptions are inherent in this knowledge? I'll give you a for example. When I went to school, a lot of our music history classes studied exclusively music written by men. Now, what is the power dynamic of this? Okay, so if I look and I have all of this entire music course, there's not a single thing written, composed by a woman. There is certainly a power dynamic there. Now, what are the assumptions? Well, we have to assume that an adequate music education does not need to include any compositions by women, at least in that class, sometimes in the whole education. I did study women composers in other classes, but there certainly were classes where I never did. So those assumptions have to stand if you're going to accept that. Now, the second level of posing problems and investigation is to personalize the problem. That means you're asking questions about how it affects you, and then also how it affects society, how it affects us as a group. So I might be saying, how does it affect me when I am only studying music of male composers? Well, I would sure like to see myself represented a little bit better in what I'm studying. And then also, how does it affect society? So I might say, what message does it send when all of the students only see male composers when they are learning about music history? What kind of message or concept does that put forward? Now we've talked about the 4 systems of oppression. We've talked about problem posing. Now I'd like to see how we could apply problem posing to the 4 systems of oppression in a pulled from real life case study. So I'm going to present you with a scenario of something that I've encountered in a music education setting, and then we're going to do a little bit of reflection about how we could maybe use problem posing. Okay, so first, we have a singer. He wants to learn about the traditional singing of his family's ethnic group. He wants to get in touch with the singing traditions of his heritage. He looks around. He discovers there's no formal opportunity to study this kind of singing. So his singing teacher suggests to him that maybe he should improve himself by studying Western European choir or opera instead. Well, let's look at this. What systems of oppression are at play in just this little description? First, we have an indication of ideological oppression by the teacher suggesting that studying a certain type of music will improve you as opposed to studying the music of your family's heritage. Second, we have institutionalized oppression because the teacher, as a representative of the education system, whether he realizes it or not, he carries a sense of power imbued in him by that institution of the education system. So we have, because of the person who is involved in this, the teacher, it is a form of institutionalized oppression. Third, we have interpersonal oppression because the teacher is disrespecting the student and his heritage, the traditions of his ethnic heritage. Now, in this short description, we don't have a direct indication that internalized oppression has occurred. It's hard to imagine that this wouldn't hurt to the young man to hear, but we don't see specifically in this example that that has occurred. Now, let's pose some problems. Why is there no opportunity to study this type of music? Who has decided what's available to study? Also, it's worth asking, how can we change that? How could we change it so that maybe we do a section of our curricula about the type of music that this young man wants to study? Then, why did the teacher assume that studying certain types of music would improve someone? Where did that come from? Now, if we personalize the problem, we'd also have to ask, how did it affect the young man to hear this from his teacher? And also, how does it affect society when we're seeing this happen in the education system? It's not hard to imagine how we're seeing a society wherein this type of music singing that this young man wants to study is not available. And effectively, in this interaction, when it was raised as a question of to the teacher, like, this is something I'm interested in, and it's shut down like this, it's conceivable that this will not be added to the curriculum in the future, and therefore, it will continue to not be available. So we've seen this moment when it kind of popped up. There was an opportunity here, and the teacher kind of shut it down, and we're not going to see change. This perpetuates the same lack of access to study that kind of singing, right? So we see the effect on society. Let's try another one. Okay, we have a female composition student. Another student tells her, there isn't much music written by women in the canon, which suggests that women can't compose very well. The young lady, unfortunately, starts to believe this, and she gradually loses interest and falls off of her compositions. Now, I want you to reflect and tell me, what systems of oppression are at play in just this little snippet? I'm going to give you a moment to reflect. Okay, so first, we have ideological oppression, because the student says women can't compose well. There's an ideological belief. Second, this one's kind of sneaky. Institutional oppression. They're both students, so it can't be institutional oppression because it's not from the teacher, right? But here's the problem. Why aren't there any women composers in the canon in this instance, or there's not very many women composers in the canon? So what we see is not only an institution of education that has elected to present a collection of mostly male composers, but also a history of institutionalized oppression against women that either prevented women from composing music by not giving them access to training or encouraging them to have professions as composers, or allowing them to publish music that they had composed. But we see that history of that system of blocking women or even removing their things from the canon, not promoting them, but not promoting their music. But also we see the current schooling is also selecting a canon to teach the students that is still omitting those voices. Now we also have interpersonal oppression because we have the student saying this to another student. And in this example, we do see explicitly that the young lady has internalized this ideology and has actually fallen off from her composing. Let's pose some problems. Why did the student feel comfortable and confident saying that to the young lady? Who has decided what's in the canon? This current schooling, but also in the past. What past historic oppressions may have led to this? And then also, why did the young lady believe this? The young composer believed this when she heard this. Now, here's an interesting thing. It seems odd that she would start to believe this and stop composing just from hearing one comment from a student. So one has to wonder, if this ideology exists, the institution around her is selecting a canon that doesn't include women. She's hearing this from her classmates. What messages are around her that are counteracting all of those? Does she exist in a world where this is the only message that she's hearing? If so, it's not hard to understand how she would internalize that. So, let's personalize these problems. How does it affect the young lady when she hears this? Well, we see a clear outcome that she stopped composing, which means she stopped creating music that could be added to the future canon. So when you ask the question, how does it affect society? Well, unfortunately, one female composer will not be contributing to the future canon because of this interaction, which means it has effectively perpetuated the same lack of material that has led to this belief in the first place, right? So we see the cycle. Now, we've talked about the systems of oppression, and we've talked about how problem posing can be a moment to say, hey, stop. Let's investigate some of these assumptions that are happening, and let's interrupt these systems of oppression that might be at play. But how do you know if you're successful? Well, in 2005, Frank Abrahams proposed that there are 5 principles of critical pedagogy that must all be met in order for a critical pedagogy problem-posing interaction to be successful. First, there is a conversation involving problem posing and solving. Now, we didn't get into solving very much, but solving is interesting because if you remember when I asked the question, who picks what type of music we study and how can we change that? It's that how can we change that where sometimes the solving comes in. It's when you say, well, who picked this music? Can we change it? Let's change it. And then you might update the established knowledge to actually reflect some of these missing voices after these critical discussions have raised the fact that they're missing. So the solving is interesting because since you're investigating with your students, often they are suggesting the solutions that you can implement to update the knowledge. So, number 2, after the interaction, the student should have an expanded reality. So let's imagine that you're a teacher in the room with that female composition student and her peer who told her that women can't compose well. And let's say that you interrupt that interaction and you say, hold on, let's talk about this. Now, who do you think selects the canon? Why do you think women are missing from it? And you ask them to pose some problems and answer. At the end of that interaction, you might have the student who said that thinking a little bit differently, or at least questioning what they had believed or maybe the assumptions they'd made. And then you have the young lady who now has a reality where she's hearing somebody push back on that idea and propose that maybe that ideology isn't sound after all. How might that have affected her internalizing of the oppression? Might have helped her avoid that. So we have an expanded reality. Next, we have the learning exchange should result in conscientization. which means it's not just a knowledge retention. It's not just about memorizing information. It has to lead to real world action. This means that people are doing things in the world. Perhaps, as the example with the young lady who is a composer, perhaps she continues composing because of this conversation that helped her think critically about it. That would be a real world action. Number 4, both the teacher and the student must have a reshaped viewpoint. That's important because if it's an investigative partnership, that means that you as the teacher are also learning from the reflections and the questioning and the solutions proposed by the students. And so the way that we know that we're not just pushing the conversation, but we're actually partnering is that we also learn things through their eyes, and we are changed as well. And finally, critical pedagogy problem posing must have critical examination of power structures and assumptions. This is very important. We have to be asking who makes the decisions, who they represent, who's not represented, and asking questions about why. Now, in review, the systems of oppression are ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. And critical pedagogy can be posing problems about what we are teaching in order to investigate the power dynamics and the assumptions. Critical pedagogy can disrupt systems of oppression in the moment and over time in music education by encouraging listeners to investigate power dynamics and assumptions and including learners' voices, i.e. their critiques, their calls for accountability, and the solutions they suggest in the learning experience. Now, I'd invite you right now to pause the video and scan this code with your phone in order to download a PDF of the slide deck, including resources. And also, I'd really love to hear from you and hear your thoughts and discussions. I dearly miss seeing all of you in person. I'm so looking forward to all the conversations. So please don't hesitate to get in touch and tell me how you are seeing systems of oppression and also how you're countering them in your practice, because I'd love to share ideas and hear your feedback. And please don't be shy. Thank you.